My sister tricked me to cancel my vacation so I could babysit her kids for free. When I discovered she took a vacation instead, I made sure she paid back in ways she never expected. I'm 29 and have always been into medicine. It all started with my grandmother's Alzheimer's. Watching her go through that changed me. I remember sitting with her, answering the same question 5 times in 10 minutes, knowing she didn't mean it, but feeling my heart break all the same. That's when I decided to become a physical therapist. I worked hard, really hard. Part of my training included volunteering with kids who had developmental challenges, mostly autism. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. One boy, Ben, wouldn't speak to anyone for weeks. Then one day, I brought him a toy train, and his face lit up. Moments like that reminded me why I chose this path. It wasn't just a career, it meant something to me. But my family, they never saw it that way. To them, my job was just babysitting, something I could handle on the side because I already worked with kids. Coming home after a 10-hour shift, completely drained, didn't mean much. If Joanne needed someone to watch her kids, it was expected that I would help. No questions asked. I'd end up taking care of them for the entire night without even grabbing dinner first. To my parents, I was doing it for free anyway, so why not pitch in for the family? It didn't matter that it was my career. To them, it was all the same. And then there's Joanne. She's 34, has 3 kids, Maya, Ethan, and Lucas. And somehow, being the first to have kids made her the star of the family. My mom practically worships her. Every time we'd talk, it would circle back to one thing. When are you going to have kids? Like my entire worth was tied to that. I could work all the hours in the world, help hundreds of kids, but none of it seemed to matter. Joanne's kids were the center of everything, and I was just there, expected to help out because I didn't have a family of my own. What really stung was how much my mom valued traditional family roles. Joanne had done everything right in her eyes, married young, had kids, and settled into suburban life. Meanwhile, my accomplishments felt invisible. Everything revolved around her and her family. I was there to clean up after her kids, to take care of them, but never as an equal. It's like my career was just a placeholder until I settled down. No one in my family ever understood what my work really meant to me, or why I dedicated so much of myself to it. All they saw was someone without kids, without the right priorities, and they never hesitated to remind me of it. It's funny because while I love working with autistic kids, it's not my responsibility to babysit my sister's kids every time she needs help, but no one seemed to care. It was like I was the family's backup plan for everything. They assumed that since I was good with kids, babysitting was part of my role too. I didn't see it then, but it's like they all saw me as some kind of helper, not someone with her own life and career. But honestly, the worst part was Kevin, Joanne's husband. When they first got married, he was fine, neutral even. But now, every time I come over, he's quick to dump the kids on me and say something like, they love hanging out with Auntie, as if I didn't have my own plans. He got used to the idea that I was just there to help whenever they needed, no questions asked. At some point, it felt like I was part of the household service team. They never said it out loud, but in their heads, my life and my career were just supporting roles in their family. So, fast forward to this past summer. I'm finally on vacation, which is rare because I'm usually either working or helping out with my sister's kids. My boyfriend and I had been planning this trip for months. Nothing fancy, just a few days at a beachside resort. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but of course, that's when I get the call. It's Joanne, and she's absolutely panicked. She's crying, saying that Lucas, the youngest, is having trouble breathing and they're rushing him to the hospital. I know Lucas has asthma, so my heart stops when I hear this. I'm already thinking worst-case scenarios, imagining him in an ambulance. I drop everything, tell my boyfriend we've got to head back, and start looking for the earliest flight home. I can barely focus, just thinking about poor Lucas in the hospital. I called Joanne back a few times while I was at the airport, but all I got were short, vague responses. He's stable for now, or we're with the doctors. No details, no nothing. It was driving me nuts, but I didn't have much choice but to wait it out until I could get home. After a long, stressful flight, I land back in my city. Joanne's supposed to pick me up, and when I see her at the airport, she's just off. No panic, no tears. I ask her right away how Lucas is, and she casually says, "Oh, he's fine now. The doctors checked him out, and it was just a minor asthma scare." My mind couldn't even process that for a minute. I'd just dropped everything to rush back, and now I'm hearing that it was barely an emergency. It felt like a punch in the gut. I ask her if I can go see Lucas at the hospital, thinking maybe he's still there, but Joanne hesitates. That's when she drops the bombshell. Lucas is fine, already home, and this whole thing, it wasn't about getting me back for him. No. They're still going on their trip with their friends, and they need me to babysit the kids for the next 3 days. I'm standing there in the middle of the airport with my suitcase in hand, stunned. I literally cut my vacation short, booked an emergency flight all because they needed a babysitter? Joanne just keeps talking like it's no big deal. "We didn't want to ask you outright because we thought you wouldn't come back," she says, like that makes it better. I'm beyond angry at this point, but what can I do? I'm already back home, and now they're off to their trip, leaving me with their kids. And of course, Kevin's no help either. He shows up right as we pull into their driveway, acting like this whole thing is perfectly normal. No apology, no thank you. Just "we left some money for you on the counter," and a quick wave goodbye before they sped off to pick up their friends. I couldn't believe it. I was sitting there with the kids, knowing I'd been completely manipulated. They knew I wouldn't just fly home for a babysitting gig, so they had to lie about it being an emergency, and I guess it worked. But let me tell you, I wasn't about to let this slide. I knew they were expecting me to just watch the kids like I always do, no complaints. But this time, I had something else in mind. So there I was, stuck in my sister's house with 3 hyperactive kids, completely blindsided by what just happened. Joanne and Kevin had gone off on their little trip, and I was left picking up the pieces as usual. I couldn't stop thinking about how they'd lied to get me back here. Like, they knew I wouldn't just drop everything to babysit. So they pulled the whole, Lucas is having an emergency card. And the worst part? It worked. Normally, I would have just sucked it up. I mean, it's not like this was the first time they dumped their kids on me without so much as a second thought. But this time, I was done. I wasn't about to spend the next 3 days bending over backward for them while they were out having fun. That's when I came up with a plan. Instead of trying to deal with everything myself, I decided to hire someone else to take over. There's this kid down the street, Carly. Maybe 16 years old, really sweet, but totally clueless when it comes to babysitting. I figured she was perfect for what I had in mind. I called her up and asked if she wanted to make some extra money watching Joanne's kids. Of course, she jumped at the chance. The next morning, Carly shows up, all smiles, ready to take on the challenge. I gave her a quick rundown of the basics, what the kids like, their routines, not that I cared if she stuck to them, and told her to just have fun. I mean, she's a teenager. I knew she'd let the kids get away with pretty much anything, and that's exactly what I wanted. I wasn't planning on sticking around for the chaos. I told Carly I'd be back in the evening, but really I just spent the day out of the house doing my own thing. I went to a coffee shop, got a massage, and caught up with my boyfriend, who was still annoyed about the whole situation. I needed to cool off, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel a little smug knowing what was going on back at the house. When I came back later, it was just as I expected. The house was a mess. Maya had gotten into Joanne's expensive makeup, painting her face like she was ready for a costume party. Ethan and Lucas had turned the living room into their personal soccer field, with pillows, toys, and snack wrappers scattered everywhere. Carly was trying her best to keep them under control, but it was clear she was in way over her head. And you know what? I didn't care. For once, it wasn't my problem. For the next 2 days, I kept this going. Carly would come in, let the kids run wild, and I'd step out for most of the day. The kids were having the time of their lives, and I was finally taking a break from playing the responsible adult. Every time I checked in, the house got worse and worse. There were clothes piled up, dishes everywhere, and I swear I found crumbs in places I didn't think crumbs could get. But the best part? I didn't lift a finger to fix any of it. By the time Joanne and Kevin got back, the house looked like a bomb had gone off. They walked in the door, bags in hand, expecting to see everything neat and tidy, like I'd been their personal maid for the past 3 days. But when they saw the mess, their jaws dropped. Kevin lost it first. "What the hell happened here?" he shouted. I just shrugged, playing it cool. "Oh, the kids had fun. You know how it is." Joanne was furious too. "Maya, what did you do with my makeup? And why is the living room trashed?" I wasn't about to let them pin this on me. I calmly told them I'd hired a babysitter, Carly, and that I'd been out most of the time. "I didn't want to ruin your trip," I said, laying it on thick. "So I figured it was best to get some extra help. I didn't think you'd mind." Kevin's face went red. "You let some teenager watch our kids?" "Yeah," I said, "just like you let me drop everything and come back early from my vacation for a non-emergency. Seemed fair." They were fuming, but what could they say? I wasn't the one who let the kids run wild. And honestly, watching them scramble to figure out how they were going to clean up the mess was kind of satisfying. I could tell they were furious, but for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't owe them anything. They'd manipulated me one too many times, and now they were going to deal with the consequences. So they came back from their trip, walked into the house, and yeah, it was a mess. I knew it would be. The second they saw Maya's makeup all over the carpet and the disaster in the living room, they freaked out. There was makeup smeared across the rug like someone had finger painted with it, and glitter was everywhere, like in places I didn't even think glitter could get. Kevin was the first to go off, pacing around the living room, his face red, muttering numbers under his breath. "This is going to cost at least $1,000 to fix," he kept saying. Every time he pointed at something, like the juice stains on the couch or the crumbs ground into the carpet, he'd snap, "How could you let this happen?" Honestly, I wasn't even surprised. Joanne wasn't yelling like Kevin, but she had that tight-lipped look she always gets when she's trying not to lose it. "Why didn't you handle this yourself?" she finally asked, rubbing her temples like she was the one who'd had to deal with everything. It was like she completely forgot that they tricked me into coming home early for a fake emergency. I just stayed calm because at this point I'd had enough. They left me to deal with their kids because they lied about an emergency. I told them straight up that it wasn't my job to clean up after their mess, especially when they'd tricked me into coming home early. Kevin kept pacing, throwing out numbers for how much it was going to cost to clean everything up. He kept going on about the carpet and the repairs, saying I should pay for it. I told him no. There was no way I was paying for anything when they were the ones who dumped their kids on me and expected me to just deal with it. Of course, Joanne called my mom, and my mom took her side. Like always, it didn't matter what actually happened. To my mom, Joanne's always the one who needs protecting. "You've always been so responsible with the kids," my mom said over the phone. "Why didn't you just handle it? Joanne's got enough on her plate." It was the same thing she always said, like it was my job to clean up after everyone else. I told her I wasn't having it this time. What was surprising was that my dad, who usually keeps quiet, actually stood up for me. They lied to her and they should deal with it, he said. And that was it. He never says much, but hearing him say that, it felt like a big deal. For once, I didn't feel like I was completely alone in this. Meanwhile, Joanne and Kevin kept trying to make me feel bad about the mess, talking about all the damage the kids had done. Kevin kept pointing at the stain on the carpet like it was a crime scene. "This is going to cost a fortune," he said over and over. But I wasn't backing down. I'd already decided I wasn't going to be their doormat anymore. I wasn't going to clean up or pay for anything. They made their choices, and they were going to have to deal with the fallout themselves. By the time I left, the house was still a wreck, and they were still fuming. But I didn't care. I'd finally set my boundaries. I wasn't going to let them guilt me into cleaning up or paying for anything. They tricked me, and they paid the price. Simple as that. After leaving Joanne and Kevin's house, I thought I was done with all the drama. I felt lighter, like I'd finally drawn the line that I should have set years ago. But of course, Joanne wasn't going to let it go that easily. A few days after the whole mess, I started getting calls from our extended family. At first, it was just a couple of cousins checking in, but it didn't take long before it turned into full-blown family gossip. Apparently, Joanne had been spreading her version of the story to anyone who would listen, telling them how I abandoned her kids and let them destroy the house. She twisted the situation to make it sound like I was irresponsible and selfish, leaving out the part where she and Kevin lied to me to get me to come back. Typical Joanne. And of course, my mom was right there, backing her up. The calls from family members started piling up. Aunt Carol called, sounding concerned. "Why didn't you just help her out? You've always been so good with the kids. This isn't like you." Uncle Bob left a voicemail saying, "We're family. You need to apologize to Joanne and make things right." At first, I felt that old familiar guilt creeping back in. The same guilt I'd felt my whole life whenever Joanne needed something, and I wasn't there to jump in. But then I stopped myself. I reminded myself what really happened. I was manipulated, lied to, and used. This wasn't on me. So, I made a decision. Instead of letting Joanne's version of events spread unchecked, I started calling back the relatives who'd reached out. One by one, I told them the real story. I explained how Joanne had faked an emergency with Lucas to trick me into coming home early, how they expected me to babysit for free, and how I finally stood up for myself. Some of them were surprised, shocked even. They had no idea Joanne had lied about the whole thing. A few of them actually apologized for assuming the worst and admitted they'd had their suspicions about Joanne's version of the story. Others were less convinced. "Well, you know how Joanne can be," they said, brushing it off like it was just some sibling squabble. But a few of them, surprisingly, Aunt Carol included, sided with me. "Good for you," Aunt Carol said during our second conversation. "You've been taken advantage of for too long. I'm glad you're finally standing up for yourself." I could tell that my decision to stand firm was creating ripples in the family. It was like the cracks in the perfect family image were finally starting to show. Joanne had always been the golden child in my mom's eyes, but now that other family members were hearing my side, things were starting to shift. I wasn't the villain Joanne tried to paint me as. I was just the one who had had enough. But the guilt trips didn't stop. My mom was relentless, calling me almost every day. "You need to apologize to Joanne," she'd say. "Family is family, and you don't just walk away from that. You know how much the kids love you." It was exhausting, but every time she tried to drag me back in, I stood firm. "I'm not apologizing, Mom. I didn't do anything wrong. Joanne lied to me, and I'm done being taken for granted." It wasn't easy, though. The family backlash was strong, but for the first time in my life, I was putting myself first, and I wasn't going to let their manipulation drag me back into that toxic cycle. Some relatives were still on Joanne's side, but a few had started to see the truth, and that was enough for me. It wasn't about winning people over or proving a point. It was about setting boundaries that should have been there a long time ago. By the end of the week, the calls started to slow down. I had no regrets. Sure, there were still family members who thought I was in the wrong, but at least now I knew who actually supported me and who was just repeating Joanne's story without question. The family dynamic was shifting, and while it wasn't perfect, I was finally out of the role they'd shoved me into for so long. I wasn't the helper anymore. I wasn't the backup plan. I was finally my own person, and if that meant stepping away from certain family members, then so be it. It didn't take long for things to escalate even more. I should have seen it coming, but honestly, I thought that once I set my boundaries, Joanne would eventually get the message and back off. Boy, was I wrong. The next big blow-up happened at our cousin Emily's birthday party, a family event that I almost didn't go to because I knew there'd be tension. But I figured, how bad could it be? I was wrong. We were all sitting outside, enjoying some food, when Joanne decided to make her move. I guess she'd been waiting for the perfect moment to turn the family against me in person, not just through phone calls. Everyone was having a good time, chatting and laughing, when Joanne stood up, holding her drink like she was about to give a toast. But instead of something nice, she launched into a full-blown rant about me. I just don't understand how some people can turn their backs on family when we've always been there for them, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't react. I mean, we've all had moments where we've needed help, but some of us think we're too good to lend a hand. Everyone went quiet. All eyes turned to me, and I could feel the tension rise. Joanne kept going, playing the victim like she always does. When Kevin and I needed help, we reached out to someone we thought we could trust, but apparently that was a mistake. Apparently some people don't care about family anymore. She was going all in now, bringing up every little thing I hadn't done for her over the years, twisting the narrative to make it sound like I'd been abandoning her and the kids every time they needed something. The worst part? She didn't just focus on the recent mess. Joanne started digging up old stories, things that had happened years ago, making it sound like I'd been neglecting my duties as a sister for a long time. It was like she had been saving all these grievances just to use them against me when she needed to play the martyr. For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of guilt. It's what Joanne's always done best, make me feel like the bad guy. And from the looks on some of the family members' faces, it was working. A few people were nodding, clearly buying into her version of events. But I wasn't the same person I used to be. I wasn't going to let her manipulate the situation again. I stood up slowly, and everyone's attention shifted to me. My heart was racing, but I kept my voice steady. You know what, Joanne? You're right about one thing. I'm not going to keep helping out when I'm lied to and manipulated. That got a few murmurs from the crowd. I took a deep breath and continued. Joanne, you lied about Lucas being in the hospital, so I'd drop everything and come home. And you did it because you expected me to just fall in line like I always do, like I'm your personal babysitter. Well, I'm done. I'm done being the family's backup plan, and I'm done being taken for granted. Joanne opened her mouth to say something, but I wasn't finished. You keep talking about family, but family doesn't manipulate each other like you and Kevin did. Family doesn't guilt-trip each other into doing things they don't want to do. And family definitely doesn't expect one person to always put everyone else first. I could see the shock on a few faces. My mom looked uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. My dad stood quietly to the side, arms crossed, watching. I knew he was on my side, even if he wasn't going to speak up. I've spent years doing everything I could to help out, I said, but it's never enough for you, Joanne. You always want more. Well, I'm done giving. From now on, I'm setting boundaries. You can't keep expecting me to put my life on hold whenever you decide you need something. There was a moment of stunned silence. I wasn't angry, I wasn't yelling, I was just calm, firm, and clear. And for the first time, it felt like people were actually listening. Joanne's face turned red. So what? You're just going to walk away from this family? I shook my head. I'm not walking away from the family, Joanne. I'm walking away from the guilt, the manipulation, and the expectation that I'll always be there to fix things for you. If you need help, you can hire someone. If you want a relationship with me, it's going to be based on respect, not obligation. The air was thick with tension, but I didn't care. I had said what I needed to say, and I knew I couldn't back down now. I turned to leave, and a few relatives were staring at Joanne like they finally saw through her act. As I made my way toward the door, Aunt Carol caught my eye and gave me a small nod of support. At least someone understood. The drive home was quiet, but I felt lighter. For the first time, I had publicly set my boundaries, and I hadn't let Joanne drag me back into her web of manipulation. Sure, some family members might still side with her, but that didn't matter to me anymore. I wasn't living for their approval. After Joanne's outburst at the party, things in the family were different. You could feel the shift. Some relatives still stuck by Joanne's side, convinced that she was the victim in all of this. It wasn't surprising. There have always been those family members who believe the loudest voice in the room. Joanne had spent years building her narrative, and I guess for some people, it was easier to stick with what they thought they knew. My mom, of course, was still firmly in Joanne's corner. She called me a few days after the party, but it was the same old story. Joanne's upset. "You need to fix this. She's your sister." It was like my mom couldn't see that I was the one who'd been lied to and manipulated. To her, it was always about keeping the peace, no matter who got hurt in the process. And apparently, that person was always supposed to be me. But then there were the others. Aunt Carol was one of them. She called me up a couple of days after the party just to check in. "I saw what happened, and honestly, I'm proud of you," she said. "It's about time someone stood up to Joanne. She's been getting away with too much for too long." It wasn't just Carol. A few of the other relatives started reaching out too, offering support in ways I didn't expect. Uncle Bob, who had initially sided with Joanne, sent me a text saying, "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten for you. Sorry for jumping to conclusions." It wasn't a big apology, but it was something. A few cousins even invited me to dinner, saying they hadn't realized how one-sided things had been for years. I could feel the cracks in Joanne's perfect family image starting to show. For the first time, people were seeing her manipulation for what it was, and they were realizing I wasn't just being difficult or selfish. I was standing up for myself, and that was a new dynamic no one had really seen before. It was strange, though. With every supportive call or message I got, I also felt a little sad. This whole thing had torn the family in two. There were the ones who saw through Joanne, and the ones who would never stop siding with her no matter what. I'll admit it wasn't easy at first. I kept thinking back to how much energy I'd put into keeping things together for everyone. For years, I let myself believe that my worth in the family came from how much I could do for them. Babysitting, cleaning, dropping everything whenever they needed me, that's how I was valued. But what had it gotten me? Just more expectations, more guilt, and more manipulation. I realized I'd spent so long playing the role of helper that I'd forgotten what it meant to just be myself. Joanne had always been the center of attention, the one with the family, the one everyone fawned over. And me, I was the support system. I guess I thought that was how I fit into the family, by doing whatever needed to be done without asking for anything in return. But now that I was stepping out of that role, it felt both freeing and terrifying. I wasn't sure what my place was anymore, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to be the family's go-to fixer anymore. And that realization hit harder than I expected. For so long, I had based my worth on what I could do for other people. But now I was starting to figure out that I didn't need to keep proving myself through endless favors and sacrifices. I could just be me. My mom still didn't get it. She kept pushing for a family meeting to talk things out, but I wasn't interested. What was there to talk about? I'd made my boundaries clear, and I wasn't going to let her or Joanne guilt me into backing down. I think my dad understood, even if he didn't say much. He called me a couple of times after the party, just to check in, but he never pushed me. He didn't have to say it, but I knew he was quietly on my side. That meant more to me than any grand gesture ever could. As for Joanne and Kevin, they didn't reach out at all. I heard through the family grapevine that they were still fuming, blaming me for the division in the family, like it was my fault they'd been caught in their own lies. It didn't surprise me. Joanne was never one to take responsibility for her actions, but it didn't matter. I wasn't looking for an apology, and I certainly wasn't going to chase after one. Instead, I focused on the relationships that actually mattered, the family members who had reached out, the ones who were starting to see the real me, not just the version Joanne had painted. I started to rebuild my own sense of self-worth, without the constant weight of family expectations hanging over me. And you know what? It felt good. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I wasn't bending over backward to make everyone happy. I was finally learning how to put myself first, and it was about time. After the dust settled, things in the family stayed pretty divided. I stopped getting daily calls from my mom, but she still tried to fix things from time to time. Like everything could just go back to normal if I apologized and went back to being Joanne's backup. That wasn't happening. I had finally stood up for myself, and there was no way I was going back to how things were. As the weeks passed, I started feeling a sense of relief I hadn't realized I needed. Without the constant pressure of being on call for family emergencies, or non-emergencies disguised as crises, I had time to focus on myself. My career had always been important to me, but now I had the mental space to dive into it fully. I had always wanted to be more involved in helping kids with autism, but between work and family obligations, I never seemed to have the time. But now I was free to do what I wanted, and I wasn't going to let anyone stop me. I started looking into mentorship programs for kids with autism, and within a few weeks, I was volunteering at a center nearby. It felt good to finally use my skills for something that truly mattered to me, instead of always feeling like I was just keeping everyone else's life together. Meanwhile, Joanne and Kevin were still dealing with the fallout of losing their free help. I heard through the grapevine that they were struggling to find a full-time babysitter who would work for the low rates they wanted to pay. Apparently, no one else was willing to sacrifice their own time and energy the way I had, and they were feeling the sting of it. I'll admit, part of me felt a little satisfaction knowing that they couldn't just rely on me anymore. They'd taken me for granted for so long, and now they were paying the price. But I didn't let that bitterness consume me. Honestly, I had better things to focus on. I threw myself into my work, even taking on a few new certifications that I'd put off because of family drama. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward in my career. I wasn't just treading water, waiting for the next family crisis to derail my progress. I was making choices for me. A few months later, my boyfriend and I took a trip, something I hadn't been able to do properly the last time because of Joanne's manipulation. It was nothing extravagant, just a weekend getaway in the mountains, but it felt like the first time I'd really been able to relax without worrying about a sudden call from home. We hiked, enjoyed the fresh air, and just let ourselves unwind. It was exactly what I needed. During that trip, I had a lot of time to reflect. The family drama still lingered in the background, but it wasn't weighing me down like it used to. My dad continued to quietly support me, and while my mom still wished things could go back to how they were, I knew that was never going to happen. And that was okay. I had made peace with it. Joanne and Kevin hadn't reached out since the birthday party, and I wasn't holding my breath for an apology. I didn't need one. I had moved on. One day, while hiking, I realized something. For years, I had been stuck in this loop of trying to meet everyone's expectations, feeling like my value came from what I could do for other people. But here I was, living my life on my own terms, finally free from that constant pressure. I wasn't just the helper anymore. I was the main character in my own life, and that felt good. When we got back from the trip, I started setting more goals for myself, things I'd always wanted to do but had never made time for. I joined a local fitness class, started cooking more, and even reconnected with some old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. As for the family, things were quieter now. The calls from my mom were less frequent, and when she did call, I kept the conversations short. I didn't let her drag me into guilt trips or family drama anymore. I had learned how to set boundaries and stick to them, even when it wasn't easy. My dad and I still talked, and while he didn't say much, I knew he was proud of me for standing my ground. In the end, I realized that walking away from the toxic dynamics in my family wasn't about cutting ties completely. It was about reclaiming my life and deciding how I wanted to be treated. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even family, manipulate me into sacrificing my own happiness anymore. And so, life went on. I kept working, kept growing, and kept living on my own terms. Joanne and Kevin, they were still dealing with their own issues, and I stayed out of it. I wasn't interested in their drama anymore. I had found peace, and that was all I needed.